There are seasons in a woman's life when nothing appears broken on the outside, and yet something deep within her has gone tired from carrying too much for too long. She answers the messages. She keeps the peace. She shows up. She smiles when needed. But somewhere beneath the performance of being capable, her soul has begun to whisper that this way of living is costing her more than she can name. And perhaps that is where this message begins. This reflection is drawn from an original source about worry, surrender, and letting God lead. But what rises here is not only a call to trust God with tomorrow. It is also a call for a woman to stop living as though fear is her responsibility and exhaustion is her identity. Many women do not call it worry at first. They call it being responsible. They call it caring deeply. They call it thinking ahead. They call it trying to keep everything from falling apart. But one quiet truth is that worry often wears the clothing of devotion while slowly draining the spirit. It convinces a woman that if she stays tense enough, alert enough, self-sacrificing enough, she can protect what matters. So she keeps watch over every possible disappointment. She rehearses every painful outcome. She tries to solve what has not yet happened, and in doing so, she leaves her own body, her own peace, her own center. How many women have mistaken vigilance for wisdom? How many have sat at the edge of the bed late at night, not because there was something left to do, but because the mind would not let the heart rest? How many have pressed their own needs into silence while trying to manage the emotions, expectations, and comfort of everyone around them? This is where awakening sometimes begins. Not in brightness, not in clarity, but in the moment a woman realizes that the life she has built around fear is no longer a life her soul can breathe inside. Worry is not only mental noise, it is often a spiritual posture. It is the body leaning forward as if disaster must be anticipated to be survived. It is the nervous system learning to stay on guard because disappointment has visited before. It is the heart saying, I cannot relax because the last time I did, something painful happened. So the woman becomes careful, then hyper-aware, then inwardly burdened, and after a while, she does not even know what peace feels like unless everything is going according to plan. But peace was never meant to depend on perfect conditions. The original message says clearly that worry is a thief, and this is true. Man, y'all, it steals the day while pretending to prepare you for tomorrow. It offers no wisdom equal to its cost. It does not heal the body, mend the relationship, restore the lost time, or soften the future. It only consumes the present. And for many women, that theft has gone on so long it feels normal. They have lived in a low state of emergency for years and called it maturity. But survival is not the same thing as wisdom. And peace is not the same thing as emptiness. Sometimes a woman feels strangely unsettled when life becomes quiet, not because something is wrong, but because her body has grown accustomed to strain. She may even return to overthinking because stillness feels unfamiliar. This is why healing can feel disorienting. Pain may have been heavy, but it was known. Peace asks her to become intimate with a different kind of life. So let us say something tender and honest here. You were never created to carry the whole emotional weight of the world in your chest. You were never called to hold every outcome together through fear. You were never made to abandon yourself in the name of love, responsibility, goodness, or spiritual strength. There's a difference between caring and controlling. There is a difference between prayer and panic. There is a difference between intuition and fear. Fear rushes. Fear clinches. Fear demands certainty before movement, but intuition often speaks more quietly. It does not shout over the soul. It waits beneath the noise. It says, "This relationship is costing you too much. This pace is not sustainable. This version of you was built for survival, not for truth. This is not punishment. This is your life, asking to be lived more honestly." And sometimes the first sacred act of return is not doing more. It is laying something down. What if surrender is not weakness, but maturity? What if letting God lead does not mean becoming passive, but becoming honest enough to admit that fear has made a poor master? What if the beginning of restoration is simply this? A woman stops gripping so tightly at what she was never meant to control. Perhaps this awakening began long before you named it. Perhaps it began the first time your smile felt too heavy to wear. Perhaps it began when your body grew tired of pretending. Perhaps it began when the soul inside you started knocking from within, a life that had become too small. And if you are hearing that knock now, do not be ashamed. Do not rush to silence it. Sit with it, breathe with it, let it tell the truth. Because there comes a moment when a woman can no longer heal by continuing to live against herself. And when that moment arrives, the invitation is not harsh. It is holy. It is God, in His quiet mercy, asking her to stop making a home inside fear and begin the long, gentle return to trust. And before trust becomes strong in her, it must first become honest. That is where we go next. Honest trust does not begin when a woman feels fearless. It begins when she is tired of being ruled by fear and tells the truth about what that fear has cost her. There is a kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix. It comes from holding tension in the spirit for too long. It comes from living as though your vigilance is the thread keeping everything from unraveling. It comes from believing that if you loosen your grip, everything precious will be lost. Many women know this exhaustion well. They have carried households, relationships, children, grief, disappointments, expectations, and invisible emotional labor with very little space to admit how deeply worn they feel. They have become so practiced at enduring that they no longer ask whether endurance is the form their life is meant to take. But one quiet truth is this: constant strain can become an identity if it is not interrupted. The original message speaks of surrender not as defeat, but as strength. And this is where many women must be gently re-educated in spirit, because somewhere along the way, many were taught that goodness meant endless availability, that love meant overextending, that faith meant smiling through depletion, that being needed was the same as being valued. So when the soul begins to ask for rest, boundaries, honesty, or release, guilt enters the room almost immediately. What happens when a woman has been praised more for her usefulness than for her truth? She learns to perform steadiness while quietly falling apart. She becomes the one everyone leans on, but she forgets how to lean. She comforts others while neglecting the voice inside herself. She keeps the family calm, the work intact, the friendships functioning, and all the while a deeper self waits patiently beneath the labor, asking, "When will you come back for me?" That is why surrender can feel so frightening at first, because it asks a woman to stop drawing her sense of safety from control. It asks her to release the old belief that if she does not manage everything, love will collapse, life will punish her, or God will somehow fail to meet her. It asks her to put down the false crown of self-sufficiency and receive something quieter, holier, and far more sustaining. Surrender is not collapsing. It is no longer pretending to be God in your own life. And that kind of surrender is not abstract. It becomes visible in very human ways. It looks like no longer saying yes when your body is pleading for no. It looks like pausing before rescuing someone who has made your overgiving feel like duty. It looks like admitting that you are not confused about what hurts you. You are simply afraid of what honoring that truth may require. It looks like sitting in prayer and saying, I do not know how to carry this without harming myself. Show me another way. Sometimes women imagine that if they surrender, they will become weak, passive, or directionless. But true surrender does not erase discernment. It sharpens it. It does not remove agency. It purifies it. It does not make a woman smaller. It returns her to the place where her actions are no longer driven by panic, guilt, and survival, but by clarity, groundedness, and trust. There is a holy difference between giving up and giving over. Giving up says, nothing matters. Giving over says, this matters deeply, but I refuse to destroy myself trying to control what I cannot carry alone. Giving up collapses into hopelessness. Giving over steps into relationship with God. It opens the hand. It releases the jaw. It lets the body breathe again. It allows a woman to say, I will do what is mine to do, but I will not confuse my responsibility with omnipotence. For some women, surrender begins after heartbreak. They realize they have been trying to earn love by becoming easier to disappoint. For others, it begins after burnout. They discover they have built a life that looks admirable but feels spiritually airless. For others, it comes in grief, in motherhood, in aging, in betrayal, in the ache of becoming less willing to betray themselves just to keep being accepted. However it begins, the invitation is similar. Stop gripping what is wounding you and let your soul tell the truth. The original source says that faith is not built on understanding, but on trust. This matters because many women delay peace until they can explain everything. They want to understand the timing, the meaning, the reason, the next 10 steps. They want closure before obedience. They want certainty before rest. But faith rarely unfolds that way. More often, it begins with one honest step taken in partial light. You do not need to understand every chapter to stop abandoning yourself in this one. Perhaps that is the practical guidance hidden inside surrender. It may not begin with a grand declaration. It may begin with a simple sentence written in a journal. I am tired of carrying this alone. It may begin with turning off the noise for 10 minutes and listening to what rises in the silence. It may begin with naming the fear beneath the overthinking. Not just, I am worried, but I am afraid that if I stop performing, I will not be loved. I am afraid that if I change, I will disappoint people. I am afraid that if I rest, everything will fall apart. That kind of honesty is sacred. Because once fear is named, it can no longer hide behind virtue. And then comes another question, one many women need to ask with great tenderness. What would it feel like to trust God more than I trust my own anxious overfunctioning? Not as a slogan, not as a performance, but as a lived spiritual practice. Maybe it would mean fewer rushed decisions. Maybe it would mean listening before reacting. Maybe it would mean leaving space in the day for your own soul. Maybe it would mean allowing some things to remain unresolved for a while without spiraling into panic. Maybe it would mean releasing the need to be understood by everyone before becoming more true to yourself. This is how surrender begins to look like strength. It steadies the inner life. It softens what has become rigid. It teaches a woman that peace is not earned through overexertion. It is received through alignment. And once she begins to taste that kind of peace, another longing awakens. She no longer wants only relief from anxiety. She wants to learn the deeper rhythm of a life led by God instead of driven by fear. And that rhythm has its own language. A life led by fear has one rhythm. It is hurried, watchful, tight in the shoulders, quick to anticipate loss. It scans every room for danger, every silence for rejection, every delay for disappointment. Even when it appears composed, it is rarely at rest. But a life led by God carries a different rhythm, and many women do not recognize it at first because it does not flatter the survival self. It does not rush to soothe every insecurity. It does not feed the need to control the outcome. It invites something slower, deeper, and far more demanding of the truth. The original source says that God leads gently with peace, not pressure. This is one of the most important things a woman can learn when she is returning to herself, because many of us were trained to respond more quickly to pressure than to peace. Pressure feels familiar. It feels productive. It feels like movement. But not every urgent feeling is guidance. Not every open door is meant to be entered. Not every discomfort means keep pushing. Sometimes the soul grows quiet not because it has nothing to say, but because it is waiting for you to stop obeying panic long enough to hear it. Have you ever stayed in a room, a relationship, a routine, or a version of yourself simply because leaving it would disappoint other people? Have you ever called it loyalty when it was really fear? Have you ever silenced your own knowing because peace looked too simple to trust? These are not small questions. They are part of awakening. Because many women lose contact with themselves not through one dramatic betrayal, but through 1,000 small abandonments. The moment she laughs when something hurt, the moment she says yes while her body says no, the moment she stays available to remain lovable, the moment she ignores her unease because being good has become more familiar than being true. Over time, the inner voice grows fainter, not because it has died, but because survival has gotten louder. This is why spiritual awakening often feels less like discovering something new and more like recovering something buried. It is the return of inner listening. It is a woman hearing, perhaps for the first time in years, the difference between the voice of fear and the voice of truth. Fear is often noisy, repetitive, and urgent. It says, "Decide now or you will lose everything. Fix this immediately or it will all collapse. Stay small or you will be punished. Keep proving, keep pleasing, keep managing, keep anticipating." But the voice of God, And the wiser voice within that aligns with him is often steadier than that. It may not always be easy, but it is rarely chaotic. It does not seduce through frenzy. It clarifies through peace. Peace, of course, is not always comfortable. Sometimes peace asks you to outgrow what once protected you. Sometimes it leads you away from what is familiar, and familiarity can feel safer than freedom for a while. A woman may say she wants a more truthful life, but when truth begins to rearrange her relationships, habits, and self-image, grief can rise alongside relief. This does not mean she is going the wrong way. It often means something false is loosening. One of the deeper truths of feminine awakening is that softness is not the opposite of strength. Softness without discernment may become self-erasure, but softness joined with truth becomes presence. It becomes a woman who can feel deeply without losing herself, a woman who can love fully without betraying herself, a woman who can remain open-hearted without becoming endlessly accessible to what harms her. That is part of what it means to let God lead. It means allowing His peace to teach you what your old patterns never could. It means learning that divine guidance may come not only in answered prayers, but in the loss of appetite for what once kept you numb. It may come in a closed door that protects your future. It may come in a growing discomfort with conversations where you disappear. It may come in a new resistance to over-explaining your boundaries. It may come in the sudden realization that a quiet life is not an empty one. How does a woman begin to recognize this rhythm in practical terms? She learns to pause before agreeing. She notices what leaves her drained and what leaves her clear. She stops assuming that anxiety is a sign of responsibility. She creates small moments of silence, not to escape life, but to hear it more truthfully. She pays attention to where she feels pressured to perform and where she feels free to be real. She stops asking only, "What do they need from me?" and begins asking, "What is true for me here? What honors God in me, not just around me?" These small acts may seem ordinary, but awakening is often built from ordinary honesty, repeated consistently, not dramatic declarations, not perfect spiritual discipline, just one faithful return at a time, one moment of listening, one boundary, one surrendered fear, one truthful no, one rested breath, one decision not to leave yourself again. The original message says that God does not shove, He invites. That matters deeply, because a woman who has lived under inner pressure may need time to trust a guidance that does not dominate her. But this is the tenderness of God. He does not lead by violating the soul. He leads by restoring it. He teaches at the pace of grace, and the more a woman follows that gentler rhythm, the more she begins to see that some of what she called confusion was actually misalignment. Some of what she called weakness was grief. Some of what she called selfishness was the first stirrings of self-respect. And some of what she called being lost was simply the beginning of being led somewhere truer. Still, even when she begins to walk in that rhythm, there are days when heaven seems quiet and the path seems hidden. And in those seasons, another wound often rises to the surface: the fear of being forgotten. For many women, one of the deepest sorrows is not only pain itself, but the fear that their pain has gone unnoticed. They have prayed in silence, waited with dignity, kept moving through disappointment. And somewhere beneath all that endurance, a question has formed that is almost too tender to speak aloud. Do I still matter here? Am I still seen by God? Or have I become invisible inside my own life? The original source speaks directly to this ache. It says that God has not forgotten you, that silence is not absence, that waiting is not abandonment. And for a woman walking through awakening, this truth is more than comfort, it is correction. Because when a season stretches on without answers, the mind can begin to create stories the soul never asked for. Maybe I missed my moment. Maybe I waited too long. Maybe what I long for is not meant for me. Maybe I am only being taught how to endure, not how to live. But many women first hear the soul in seasons of breaking. Not when life is loud and affirming, but when something old has ended and something new has not yet fully arrived. In that in-between place, a woman often feels both fragile and strangely awake. The old ways no longer fit, but the new self has not yet become familiar. She may feel hidden, delayed, even forgotten. Yet hidden and forgotten are not the same thing. A seed buried in the earth is hidden, but not abandoned. A child growing in the womb is unseen, but not neglected. A woman in a season of inner rearrangement may appear still from the outside, yet profound life can be taking shape underneath what no one else understands. This is one of the sacred reversals of awakening. What feels like emptiness may actually be preparation. What feels like delay may be protection. What feels like nothing may be a quieter kind of becoming. That does not mean waiting is easy. It is not. Waiting can scrape against the heart. It can expose old wounds of rejection and unworthiness. It can stir the places where a woman once learned that being chosen quickly meant being valued, and being overlooked meant being less. So when life slows down, when prayers are not answered on her timeline, when relationships fall away, when the outer signs of progress do not appear, she may begin to confuse holy hiddenness with personal failure. But there is dignity in listening to what no longer feels true, even when you do not yet know what comes next. There is also dignity in the hidden season itself. The world tends to celebrate visible arrival. It praises what can be displayed, measured, announced, but much of a woman's deepest healing happens without applause. It happens in the private decision not to text the person who always leaves her emptier. It happens in the quiet grief of realizing how long she has lived for approval. It happens when she stops numbing what hurts and begins to sit beside herself with compassion instead of judgment. It happens when she prays honestly instead of beautifully. It happens when she lets herself be held by God without trying to earn the embrace. This hidden work matters. It may not impress anyone. It may not produce immediate evidence, but it is changing the root, and whatever changes the root changes the life. Have you ever mistaken stillness for stagnation simply because nothing around you could yet prove what was changing within you? Have you ever judged your own becoming because it did not look dramatic enough to count? Have you ever thought you were behind, when in truth you were simply being deepened? Many women carry shame about their hidden seasons. They feel they should be farther along, stronger, clearer, more decisive, more healed by now. But awakening does not unfold by performance. It unfolds through relationship, honesty, time, and grace. A woman may need to grieve before she can trust again. She may need to rest before she can hear again. She may need to stop striving before she can recognize the life that is calling her by name. The original source reminds us not to confuse silence with God's indifference. This is especially important for women who have lived through abandonment, betrayal, or emotional neglect. Because when human love has been inconsistent, divine quiet can be misread through an old wound. A woman may say, God is silent, but beneath that sentence is often a more ancient fear. Silence means, I do not matter. Silence means, I have been left. Yet one quiet truth is that God is not absent in the hidden places. He often does some of his deepest work there, not always by removing the ache immediately, but by strengthening the woman within it, by teaching her that she can remain loved even when life feels unresolved, by showing her that her worth does not disappear in the waiting, by helping her become less dependent on outer confirmation and more rooted in inner truth. This is where spiritual maturity begins to look very different from worldly success. It is not always loud. It is not always fast. Sometimes it is simply a woman who keeps showing up to her own life with honesty. A woman who does not rush to fill every silence. A woman who lets the unanswered questions exist without handing herself over to despair. A woman who says, I do not yet understand this season, but I will not call myself abandoned inside it. That is not passivity. That is holy endurance without self-betrayal. And slowly, something changes. The woman who once begged for immediate signs begins to grow steadier. She realizes she is not empty just because she is in between. She is not forgotten just because she is hidden. She is not failing just because the path is quiet. She is being rooted. She is being clarified. She is being prepared to carry a different kind of life. And once a woman begins to trust that she is still seen in the silence, a new strength starts to rise in her. Not loud confidence, something deeper, something calmer. A way of walking that no longer depends on external certainty to remain whole. That is where we turn next. There is a strength that grows in a woman when she stops measuring her life by what is visible and starts rooting her. It is not the polished confidence of always knowing what to say, how to appear, or where to go next. It is something quieter than that, and far more enduring. It is the strength that comes when a woman begins to trust that she can be led, even before everything becomes clear. The original source speaks of this as a kind of divine confidence, a steady assurance that grows when you let God lead. But for many women, confidence has been misunderstood for so long that they do not recognize its holiest form. They have seen confidence performed as hardness, self-display, invulnerability, or control. They have watched the world reward women who never tremble, never need, never pause, never soften. And so some have tried to become harder in order to feel safer. Others have made themselves smaller so they would not be punished for their power. In both cases, the soul is asked to live at a distance from its own integrity. But true confidence is not the absence of tenderness. It is the presence of rootedness. It is a woman no longer needing constant reassurance to believe what she already knows. It is a woman feeling fear without immediately surrendering to it. It is a woman honoring her intuition even when others do not understand it. It is a woman who does not need to dominate the room because she has finally returned to herself within it. This kind of confidence is deeply spiritual because it does not begin in ego. It begins in belonging. It begins when a woman understands, slowly and perhaps after much pain, that her life is not hanging by the thread of other people's approval, that she is not more worthy when chosen and not less worthy when left, that her truth does not become false because someone else cannot receive it, that her softness does not make her weak, and her boundaries do not make her cruel. How many women have spent years asking permission to take up their rightful space? How many have edited their instincts, softened their clarity, explained their no, minimized their gifts, delayed their becoming, all to remain acceptable? How many have confused humility with self-erasure? A woman led by fear will often shrink in advance. She will silence herself before anyone else gets the chance. She will anticipate rejection and adapt before truth can even speak. She will become agreeable in places where her spirit feels unrest. And afterward, she will call it maturity, patience, or love. But the deeper self knows. The deeper self knows when peace has been traded for approval. It knows when the body has gone tight in the presence of what the soul no longer consents to. This is why confidence in God changes a woman from the inside out, because she no longer has to build herself on unstable ground. She no longer has to create identity from praise, urgency, achievement, or romantic validation. She begins to stand in something steadier. She begins to feel, even in her uncertainty, that she is held by something larger than circumstance. And when that begins to settle into her bones, she walks differently. Not louder necessarily, but truer. She may still have trembling moments. She may still cry. She may still question, grieve, pause, or need rest. But her inner life is no longer built entirely around reaction. She is less easily thrown by the opinions of others, less willing to betray herself for temporary peace, less dependent on external outcomes to determine her worth. She becomes, in a quiet and sacred sense, inhabitable to herself again. That is the kind of confidence many women are truly longing for. Not the kind that says, I am better than anyone, but the kind that says, I do not need to leave myself to survive this moment. I can stay here. I can breathe here. I can listen here. I can trust that what is true in me does not have to be abandoned simply because it is inconvenient to others. This confidence also changes the way a woman meets uncertainty. The original source reminds us that confidence in God is not about having every answer, but about resting in the one who does. In human terms, this means a woman can take the next faithful step without demanding that all future steps reveal themselves first. She can leave what is misaligned before every detail of the future is secured. She can stop forcing timelines that were born from anxiety, not wisdom. She can let life unfold without using panic as her compass. That does not mean she becomes careless. It means she becomes anchored. Perhaps the practical expression of this looks simple from the outside. She speaks more plainly. She apologizes less for having needs. She rests before collapse, not only after it. She notices when guilt is trying to drag her back into old roles. She no longer calls emotional chaos chemistry. She no longer mistakes depletion for devotion. She makes decisions from clarity more often than fear, even if only by degrees. She begins to trust the calm voice within more than the noisy expectations around her. And slowly, the woman who once felt invisible to herself starts to reappear. She sees that she is not too much for having discernment. She is not selfish for needing space. She is not cold for refusing what dishonors her. She is not confused simply because she is changing. She is not failing because the old identity no longer fits. She is becoming. One of the most beautiful and difficult parts of awakening is that the world does not always know what to do with a woman who has stopped volunteering for her own diminishment. Some will call her distant because she is no longer over-available. Some will call her changed as though change were betrayal. Some will miss the version of her that never asked for enough. But a woman cannot return to her soul and remain fully convenient to every system that benefited from her disconnection. That is not something to fear. It is something to understand. Because confidence is not only how you stand when people approve of you, it is how you remain true when they do not. It is how you stay gentle without becoming permeable to harm. It is how you let your life be guided by something holier than image. It is how you move through the world with a soft face and a clear spine. And still, even as this confidence grows, another challenge remains. A woman may begin to trust, surrender, listen, and stand more fully in herself, yet still wonder how to live this way when the old fears return, because they do return sometimes. The worry, the second guessing, the urge to grip again. So the next movement is not perfection, it is practice. The daily, sacred practice of returning when fear tries to reclaim the throne. Awakening does not mean fear never visits again. It means fear is no longer allowed to govern the house. This is an important distinction because many women become discouraged the moment old anxiety returns. They think, I thought I had healed this. I thought I had surrendered this. I thought I had learned to trust. But healing is rarely the clean erasure people imagine, and more often, it is a new relationship to what once ruled you. The old thoughts may knock. The old urgency may rise in the body. The old longing to control the outcome may come back in moments of uncertainty. But now a woman has another choice. She does not have to hand fear the keys just because it showed up at the door. The original source urges us to choose between faith and fear, to stop planting seeds of anxiety and wondering why peace does not bloom. This is not a call to deny emotion. It is a call to discern what is leading you. Because fear can be felt without being obeyed. Worry can be noticed without being enthroned. A woman can say, yes, I feel the old ache rising, but I will not build my decisions around it. That is spiritual maturity in practice. It looks less dramatic than people think. It may look like catching yourself mid-spiral and stepping away from the need to solve the whole future before breakfast. It may look like not sending the extra message that comes from panic rather than peace. It may look like sitting with an unanswered question without turning it into a prophecy of doom. It may look like placing a hand over your own heart and saying, softly but firmly, we are not going back to a life ruled by dread. There is something deeply feminine in this kind of return. Not feminine as performance, not feminine as polished softness, feminine as presence, as receptivity to truth, as the willingness to stay in the body long enough to notice what is real. Many women have lived so long from the neck up, analyzing, anticipating, managing, interpreting, that they no longer notice how fear first speaks through the body, a tightening in the stomach, a shallowness in the breath, a racing need to fix, a compulsion to over-explain, a sudden willingness to betray one's own knowing in exchange for temporary relief. But the body often knows before the mind admits it. And part of awakening is learning to listen there, not with shame, but with reverence. What is this moment asking of me? Is this urgency true, or is it familiar? Am I responding from discernment or from an old wound that wants immediate safety? What would trust look like here, not in theory, but in one honest action? These are holy questions. They help a woman move out of automatic living and back into conscious relationship with herself and with God. Perhaps trust in daily life is smaller than we imagined, but no less sacred for being small. Perhaps it is choosing not to rehearse rejection before it happens. Perhaps it is taking a walk instead of feeding the spiral. Perhaps it is praying honestly instead of trying to sound strong. Perhaps it is admitting, I want to control this because I am afraid, and then loosening the grip anyway. Perhaps it is going to bed without one more attempt to force clarity from a tired mind. This is how peace is practiced. Not once, not perfectly, but repeatedly. The original message reminds us that surrender is giving over, not giving up. In lived experience, that means a woman still takes responsibility for what is hers. She pays attention. She acts with integrity. She tends her life, but she stops confusing obsession with devotion. She stops confusing overfunctioning with love. She stops imagining that her value is proven by how much pressure she can endure without collapsing. One of the most transformative things a woman can learn is that boundaries are often part of this practice of trust. Because every time she says yes to what drains her beyond truth, she may be saying no to the peace she has been praying for. Every time she overrides her spirit to keep others comfortable, she strengthens an old loyalty to self-abandonment. Every time she remains in unnecessary chaos because calm feels unfamiliar, she teaches her nervous system that home is still somewhere outside herself. But healing teaches another way. It teaches her to pause, to pray before reacting, to leave room in the day for silence, to tell the truth sooner, to stop bargaining with what has already made her smaller, to let disappointment be disappointment without turning it into self-condemnation, to rest before resentment, to trust that saying no to what dishonors her may be one of the ways she says yes to God. And when she fails, because at times she will, she learns not to punish herself with shame. She learns to return without drama. She learns that one fearful day does not erase the deeper work. She learns that regression is not always ruin. Sometimes it is simply another opportunity to choose differently with more tenderness than before. This matters deeply for women who have lived under harsh inner voices. Many have learned to motivate themselves through criticism. They speak to themselves in ways they would never speak to someone they love. But self-trust cannot grow in an atmosphere of inner cruelty. A woman returns to herself not only by correcting her patterns, but by changing the tone of the voice that meets her there. So when fear rises, she need not say, "What is wrong with me now?" She can say, "Something in me feels unsafe. Let me listen carefully." When she feels the urge to overgive, she need not say, "I must do more." She can say, "Let me notice whether love is present here, or only fear of disapproval." When she wants to rush ahead for relief, She can ask, what would it mean to move at the pace of truth instead of panic? This is the daily altar. This is where awakening becomes embodied. Not in dramatic revelations alone, but in repeated returns to honesty, surrender, and inner steadiness. And the more a woman practices this return, the more she begins to feel a subtle but unmistakable shift. What once felt impossible starts to feel natural. She becomes less impressed by urgency and more devoted to peace, less seduced by appearances and more guided by alignment, less willing to live divided against herself. Then another truth begins to reveal itself. Awakening is not only about relief from suffering, it is also about reclaiming the self that had to go missing in order to survive. And that return changes everything. There comes a point in a woman's awakening when she realizes she is not only trying to feel better, she is trying to come back into right relationship with herself. This is deeper than relief, deeper than calming the mind, deeper even than learning to trust more. It is the slow and sacred work of gathering the scattered parts of the self and calling them home. The part that learned to go quiet in order to stay loved. The part that became hyper-capable because no one came when she needed support. The part that confused being chosen with being safe. The part that wore strength like armor and forgot that true strength can breathe. The part that kept adapting, adjusting, anticipating, until she could no longer tell the difference between who she was and who she had learned to be in order to survive. This is why spiritual awakening can feel so tender, because it does not simply ask a woman to believe new things. It asks her to feel what she had to leave unfelt. It asks her to notice where she has been living against her own soul. It asks her to recognize that some of her most exhausting patterns were not personality, but protection. Not destiny, but adaptation. The original source speaks with great beauty about letting God lead, about walking with confidence because the path is held in divine hands. But what does that mean for a woman who has spent years disconnected from her own inner life? It means that being led by God will often involve being led back through the places where she disappeared from herself. It will involve truth. It will involve grief. It will involve release. Because God does not only lead us toward outcomes, He leads us toward wholeness. And wholeness often begins with remembrance. Not the remembrance of an idealized self, not some perfected woman untouched by pain, but the deeper self beneath performance, the one who still knows what peace feels like, the one who can sense when something is off, even before she has language for it, the one who does not need to become more impressive to become more true, the one who remembers that femininity is not fragility, it is presence. It is receptivity without passivity. It is tenderness joined with discernment. It is beauty with backbone. It is the capacity to remain soft without surrendering one's center. Many women have been taught a distorted version of softness. They were told that being feminine meant being agreeable, unguarded, endlessly patient, endlessly available, endlessly forgiving without truth, endlessly accommodating without self-respect. But that is not sacred softness. That is often conditioned self-erasure. Sacred softness tells the truth. Sacred softness does not beg to be chosen. Sacred softness does not call self-abandonment love. Sacred softness can weep and still say no. Sacred softness can remain kind without reopening the door to what has already dishonored it. This is one of the most important clarities in a woman's awakening. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are often the structure that allows love to remain honest. A boundary says, I will not keep participating in what asks me to disappear. I will not offer my body, time, mind, or spirit to what repeatedly leaves me fragmented. I will not confuse access with intimacy. I will not confuse guilt with goodness. For many women, this kind of truth is disorienting at first because they were rewarded for being easy to draw from. They were told, directly or indirectly, that their worth was proven by how much they could carry, how little they needed, how quietly they suffered, how available they remained. So when awakening begins to give them language for sacred refusal, an old guilt may rise quickly. Who am I to change? Who am I to stop? Who am I to disappoint people? Who am I to become less reachable, less accommodating, less endlessly willing? And the answer, tenderly, is this: you are a woman with a soul. You are a woman whose life belongs not to fear, not to performance, not to the endless management of other people's comfort, but to truth. Sometimes the inner life asks us to outgrow what once protected us. Sometimes healing asks us to stop romanticizing what merely familiarized us with pain. Sometimes awakening begins the moment a woman stops silencing what she already knows. Have you been calling your exhaustion a season when it is really a signal? Have you been waiting for permission to leave what your spirit has already outgrown? Have you been telling yourself to be more patient with something that has only become more costly to your peace? These are not accusations. They are invitations. Because the soul does not awaken to shame you. It awakens to free you. And freedom, in this deeper sense, is not a dramatic reinvention. It is often 1,000 small acts of return. A woman starts dressing in ways that feel more like herself. She speaks more slowly and more truthfully. She notices when her yes is false and her no is holy. She stops reaching toward people who only respond to her when she is depleted enough to be manageable. She lets some versions of herself die with gratitude instead of clinging to them out of habit. She becomes less interested in appearing good and more devoted to being real. This is what it means to move from survival into self-possession. Self-possession is not hardness. It is not emotional distance. It is not selfishness. It is the quiet integrity of a woman who no longer vacates herself in order to belong. She can still love deeply. She can still serve freely. She can still grieve fully. But now she does so without handing away the center of her life. The original source reminds us that when God leads, we can walk with steady confidence even through uncertainty. Here is the feminine depth within that truth. A woman becomes steadier not only because she trusts God above her fear, but because she is no longer constantly at war with herself. Her outer life and inner knowing begin to come into closer alignment. She stops scattering her energy across false obligations, anxious performances, and misaligned attachments. And in that gathering, power returns. Not loud power, not performative power, but the unmistakable radiance of a woman who has come back into her own presence. She enters a room differently. She makes decisions differently. She prays differently. She waits differently. She loves differently. She does not chase as she once did. She does not explain as she once did. She does not panic as she once did, because something in her now knows. Peace is not found by running harder. It is found by returning deeper. And once a woman begins to live from that place, life itself starts to rearrange around the truth she can finally bear to honor. Not all at once, not without cost, but with a kind of sacred inevitability. The false begins to fall away. The forced begins to loosen. The next step begins to show itself. And then, at last, she is ready to understand something even more beautiful. That this return to herself was never separate from her return to God. It was part of it all along. And perhaps that is the deepest revelation of all. The return to yourself was never a detour from the sacred. It was one of the ways the sacred was calling you home. For many women, God was introduced through duty before intimacy, through endurance before tenderness, through obedience before belonging. So they learned to be faithful while still feeling far from themselves. They learned to serve while secretly starving. They learned to pray while their own inner life went unattended. They learned to stay good, stay pleasing, stay available, stay composed. And in that long effort to be enough, some forgot that God was never asking them to disappear in order to be loved. The original source reminds us again and again to stop worrying, to surrender, to let God lead, to trust that we are seen, held, and carried. And when those truths move through a woman's awakening, they become more than comforting phrases. They become a way of living that restores her from the inside. She begins to understand that God's guidance is not only about where she goes, it is also about who she is becoming while she walks. Not more impressive, not more admired, more true, more whole, more able to remain in her own spirit without fear. This is why awakening is not a performance of enlightenment. It is not becoming untouchable. It is not floating above grief, anger, longing, or uncertainty. It is becoming honest enough to live in sacred relationship with reality. Honest about what hurts. Honest about what no longer fits. Honest about where fear still speaks. Honest about what the soul has been trying to say through exhaustion, tears, restlessness, and the ache for something deeper. And here is the mercy in it. God does not wait for a woman to become polished before he meets her there. He meets her in the middle of the unraveling. He meets her in the pause after disappointment. He meets her in the prayer that barely forms. He meets her when all she can offer is truth, not pretty truth, not spiritual language crafted to sound strong, just truth. I am tired. I am afraid. I have been carrying too much. I do not know what comes next. I have abandoned myself in ways I am only beginning to understand. I want to come home, but I need help getting there. There is profound dignity in a prayer like that, because it is real. And reality is one of the holiest places a woman can begin again. Perhaps that is what letting God lead truly means. Not that every path suddenly becomes easy, but that a woman stops trying to force herself through life without relationship, without listening, without grace. She begins to walk with God instead of merely speaking about him. She begins to let peace interrupt her panic. She begins to let truth interrupt her pleasing. She begins to let discernment interrupt her old loyalty to suffering. She begins to trust that love from God will not ask her to betray the soul he placed within her. What would change if you believed that fully? What would soften if you stopped treating your inner life like an inconvenience? What would become clear if you no longer mistook tension for responsibility? What would fall away if you believed that being led by God includes being led out of self-abandonment? What if the next step in your spiritual life is not striving harder, but listening deeper? Sometimes a woman imagines that her healing must arrive as one grand moment, one dramatic breakthrough, one unmistakable sign. But more often, grace enters quietly, in how she speaks to herself when fear returns, in how she rests without apology, in how she declines what once would have earned her approval but cost her peace, in how she notices the difference between loneliness and misalignment, between chemistry and chaos, between obligation and love, in how she allows herself to be changed by truth without demanding that change look elegant. This is the river returning to its own course after years of being redirected. This is the body remembering it does not have to live braced. This is the soul learning that safety is not found in endless adaptation. This is a woman gathering the scattered pieces of herself and, with God beside her, calling them home. And yes, there will still be days of uncertainty, days when old grief rises, days when the future feels hidden, days when she must choose trust again, not because she has failed, but because she is human. But even those days begin to feel different when she knows this one quiet truth. She is no longer alone inside herself. God is there. Truth is there. The deeper self is there. And together they are teaching her how to live. So if you are in a season where your life no longer fits the woman your soul is becoming, do not panic. If you are tired of carrying what was never yours to hold, do not shame yourself. If you are waking up to how often you have silenced your own knowing, do not despair. This recognition is not your ruin, it is your invitation. Let the old striving loosen. Let the false responsibilities fall. Let the anxious overreaching soften its grip. Let the version of you that was built only to survive bow with gratitude and step aside. A truer woman is rising now. Not louder for the sake of being seen, not harder for the sake of being safe, but steadier, clearer, softer in the right places, stronger in the necessary ones, more rooted in God, more honest with herself, more willing to live from the inside out. So breathe, dear heart. You do not have to solve your whole life tonight. You do not have to know every answer before morning. You do not have to earn the right to rest. You do not have to keep carrying fear as though it were proof of love. Let God lead you. Let peace teach you. Let truth gather you. Let grace restore you. And when the next step comes, whether it is small as a whisper or large as a turning point, take it with your whole soul. Not because you are certain of everything, but because you are no longer willing to live against what you know. That is awakening. That is healing. That is feminine restoration with roots deep in the sacred. It is not becoming someone else. It is becoming faithful to the woman God has been calling home all along.